All right, my internet is letting me down again. Nevertheless, let's do the last chapter. And I wanted to end a little bit with like 3 critical thoughts. I think so far I presented kind of like an overly positive picture. I think the articles that I uploaded for reading for this list, for this week, the podcast that I recommended, and the chapters I presented paint a very overly optimistic picture of what these interventions can achieve. But I think it's important to keep 3 bigger, larger ethical points or critical points in our mind. And the first one is to not oversell the effects of these interventions. The second one is to be aware of concept creep. Not everything is a wise intervention. And the third one is a little bit about ethical implication. If it's all about meaning, then maybe we forget meaningful change. So let me start by the first one. And I think that this is kind of epitomized by Carol Dweck. You know probably Carol Dweck. I know Carol Dweck. Half of the world knows Carol Dweck. She is a super influential psychologist, social psychologist, one of the most influential, if not the most influential social psychologist of the last 20 years. She's everywhere. She has best-selling books, TED Talks, etc. You can see this TED Talk has 11 million views, and her book is selling very well. She's a great scientist and by all accounts a good person as well. But I think there's something about it where she portrays the idea that the growth mindset can be changed very easily. That just by changing a little bit how you frame your criticism, by praising effort and not abilities, by telling children that their intelligence is like a muscle and not something fixed, that this will fix a lot of problems. I think it's a great way. I'm very much on board with that. I try to talk to my children like that. And I think if you look at the teachers at my school, if you look at how teachers are now educated, how even in nurseries, where my son used to be quite recently, everyone has basically drunken the Carol Dweck Kool-Aid. Obviously, at some point, it would come to a backlash. People would say like, "Oh, is it that good?" And people would start to replicate her effects. There's a bit of kind of controversy about her. There was earlier in the 2015 or so an article that said like, "Oh, we can't replicate it." Then it seems like a reanalysis of the results actually replicated the results. It's a back and forth. It seems that some of the effect sizes are not as strong as the original ones. I think we have to put this a little bit in perspective. I think it's too much to say that we can simply overcome, for instance, in the US, the racial achievement gap by having people to reframe their the way they think about their intelligence. I think or can help every poor neighborhood to achieve as good as every rich neighborhood in the US or in the UK or in Germany or wherever you in the world is. I think that's just asking for a little bit too much. I think there's a little bit guilt on both sides. There's some of these TED Talks, some of these articles, some of these podcasts oversell the idea. And they create outright like sky high expectations that often in reality these interventions can't hold. So we have to temper that a little bit. And I think the people who push these interventions are very much guilty of that. If I talk to people who work in a field, who work for so-called nudge units or behavior inside teams, within organizations, within the government and so forth, one of their biggest concern is that the expectations for these types of interventions are so sky high that people are disappointed often by the effect it gets out. Okay, so you come in and it's like, oh, we will do something 20 minutes with your employees and this will change your whole culture. And obviously these short small interventions can't deliver them. It looks like they have powerful, long-lasting effects, but they can't change everything that is wrong with society in our world. And there are some here, I kind of put myself on top of it, but you can see there's some evidence that others interventions that are wise interventions, such as self-affirmation interventions, where you basically kind of write before stressful events for tests and so forth about who you are as a person and what values you endorse, that that can also, as also like, oh, this will reduce the racial achievement gap in the US, and it will buffer you against stress and make you happy, and so forth and so forth. And I think it's just overselling it a little bit. And here, some of these studies just don't replicate. And it is important as psychologists to be aware of that interventions also need to be replicated, and sometimes they don't replicate. And we have to keep that in mind. And we have to kind of, the way we speak about these interventions has to be kind of checked with reality. And I think that's really important if you go into the field and work there, but also as a scientist. Yes, they're powerful. Yes, they're important, but we can't change everything just by reframing the meaning of a person or a situation. I think the second one is something I want to talk about here is what I call construct creep. I think you can see in the article that at the end, they name all the interventions where they feel like these are vice interventions. It's almost they reinterpret how the original researchers see it and kind of turn them into vice interventions. And I think that's a little bit dangerous. So for instance, there's a section on implementation intentions. These are short if-then plans that are tremendously powerful to help people boost their self-control. And we will talk about them in our self-control section, but these are by no means ways to change the meaning of reality. These are things that are meant to kind of almost work automatically by reinforcement-like mechanisms. This is not just because it works, doesn't mean it's a vice intervention. And I think by stretching and turning everything into a vice intervention, especially everything that works, we kind of lose what is special about it. None of the techniques, there are many, or there are some, not many, I don't want to exaggerate. There are some interventions in this article that use none of the 4 techniques, that dab into none of these motivations in order to change behavior. They are successful, and we can't just reframe them and call them vice intervention. I think that's important. And the third and last one I think is an important one too, is kind of think about in general what it means to do psychological interventions on the meaning. So I think a lot of these authors in the field are really have great intentions, and they want to make a real difference in the world and society. Often they're motivated by trying to overcome racial indifferences and kind of economic-based differences between poor and rich people, between poor and rich neighborhoods, and so forth. And I think this is really cool. But I think we have to keep in mind that sometimes interventions to change the meaning might stand in a way of meaningful change. And what I mean by that is like that sometimes we have to be first put a situation into place where children, where students, where people in general have actually the opportunity to excel. And then we can change the way people perceive that situation. But if there is real racism, if people face everyday prejudice and stereotypes, then reframing the meaning of these situations will not do. And I think we have to keep in mind that sometimes meaningful change is needed, and sometimes a change in meaning is needed. And that's important to not mutually exclude these two approaches. All right.